Got it. Hello, everyone. I'm Mike. I'd like to introduce you to Mooshagian, who is a researcher at the Salk Institute. He's been here for a little while, but this is his first talk that he's giving at the greater UC community. So I'm really excited to see where his research is heading and what he has to tell us today.
Okay. So, do you know the audio is working?
I think so.
Okay, great. So, yeah, good afternoon. Thank you much for taking this opportunity to talk here. It's good to be here. Instead, it's the first time I'm actually going to talk to a wider audience here to the community. I feel compelled to say right off the bat, given this is an INC talk, this is not really quite a complicated talk. There's no way of getting far here, but it's a sort of straightforward systems neuroscience talk. And I'm going to be telling you about some of the work that I've been doing over the last number of years, examining the role of posterior cortex and its role in eye and arm movement. So, primates, including humans, are particularly adept at coordinating multiple body parts, such as the eye and the arms, and so much so that we tend to really take for granted these abilities to occur so seemingly effortlessly. And in our everyday lives, we reach all the time, and we normally look to where we're going to reach. Right? So we appreciate eye-hand coordination most in its extremes. Right? So, for instance, this is Steph Curry of the Golden State Warriors. A little bit cheery this video looks like. At any rate, he is doing an eye-hand coordination drill. And sort of a lot going on there. He's dribbling a basketball with his left hand, while he's pointing to color targets with his right hand, while he's bouncing the tennis ball against the wall. This example really highlights the sort of possible complexity of eye-hand coordination. So a fundamental question in systems neuroscience is, what are the brain areas that can provide this sort of coordination? In primates, the posterior ground cortex, or the PPC, is part of the dorsal visual strain. So it receives inputs from sensory areas and projects to motor areas, and it helps transform visual spatial signals into plans for actions for the eyes and arms. Right? And we know this because in humans, damage to this region can result in a constellation of deficits, including ataxia, right? In which patients have difficulty reaching to visually guided goals in peripheral vision. Right? So this example that I'm showing here, this patient is unable to accurately reach for a pin that is being held here by this physician. Then he misreaches, reaches completely past the pencil. Okay. While brain lesions reveal a lot about the force organization of the brain, since they aren't usually restricted to a single region, they don't help elucidate the fine grained organization of the cortex. Information in that regard, the fine grained organization of PPC has come from monkey physiology and human neuroimaging experiments. In monkey reporting studies, we can train animals to move their eyes or their arms to a spatial location, or the spatial location of visual stimulus. Okay? And when cells in the PPC are reported while animals do these sort of tasks of saccade or reach tasks, different cells respond preferentially during the planning of spatially directed saccade reaches. Okay? And it turns out that saccade and reach preferring neurons are anatomically segregated. Right? Neurons that are preferentially active for saccades fall on the lateral vein of the IPS in the lateral interparietal area or area of the P. While neurons that are preferentially active for reaches fall on the medial vein of the IPS, and a region that is functionally defined known as a parietal reach region, or PRR. Okay. One of the major challenges in studying eye-hand coordination is that the stereotyped relationship between saccades and unimanual reaches, or I should say that the relationship between saccade and hand reaches is very stereotyped. Okay, and that's we look where we reach. Okay, That makes it very difficult to discern separable neural circuits, right? If we want to isolate activity that's specifically related to coordination, then we need to sort of break this stereotype, okay? And we can do that by training subjects to spatially or temporally dissociate this pod from the reach, right? I'm showing here that animal reaches in one direction, uses pods in the opposite direction, right? And this sort of approach is useful if we want to sharpen the observed differences between reach and saccade for neurons, right? But each of these sorts of patterns of movement require a great deal of training to practice in order to accomplish it reliably. And by overtraining these novel patterns, we risk circumventing natural coordination, and we might bypass the very circuitry that we're supposedly trying to study. Okay. Primates also often make bimanual movements in which each arm moves to a different target. And unlike the arms, the eyes are yoked together and can move to only one of the two targets at a time. Okay. On some occasions, an animal or a subject may choose to look first at the target with the right arm, and on other occasions, they choose to look first at the target with the left arm. Right? And we think this provides a powerful way to disentangle coordination itself from each movement type alone. So if a region is involved in eye-hand coordination, then its activity should depend on whether the eyes move with one or the other. Okay, so today I wanted to tell you about, first I'm going to describe how we can dissociate eye and arm movements by describing a novel bimanual reaching task that we've developed. And then I'm going to tell you about two major lines of my work that have used this approach to address PPC involvement in planning specific aspects of coordinated movements. Okay. In the first part, I'm going to tell you about work that's in eye-hand coordination, and then ask if the PPC plays causal roles in deriving saccades that accompany reaches. Okay. And then in the second part, I'm going to tell you about a different but related. Most neurophysiological studies of bimanual movements have focused on the motor cortex and contributions of motor cortex to movement execution. And I have asked, or I asked questions having to do with the role of prior reach in particular in planning bimanual movements. All right, and then finally, to begin, I'd like to say something about the kind of experiments I'm trying to pursue my own map here. All right, so first I'll describe the approach that I've developed to tackle these issues. All right, so consider a monkey brachiating in a tree, and he's picking a piece of fruit while he's reaching with the other hand to grasp a nearby branch in order to stabilize himself. Okay. One question we might ask is, well, which target will he look at first? Is he going to look to the fruit, or is he going to look to the branch? So rather than training animals to make dissociated eye and arm movements, we came up with something easier, just something to ask animals to reach to two things at once. Right? Right. And the task we developed looks like this. So begins with the animal fixating a central dot on the screen, and the hands are situated on home pads, sort of waist height in front of them. All right. And then two targets appear at diametrically opposed spatial locations. Okay. The stimulus locations indicate the spatial role of the movements, and then the stimulus colors instruct the type of movement to be made. Right. So the animal's been trained to make different types of regions to different colored targets. Right. So here a red target instructs a right arm reach. Okay, and a green target instructs a left arm reach. Right. And then after a variable delay period here, about 1 to 2 seconds, the fixation dot, the fixation point disappears, and that cues the animal to move. Right. After the go cue, the animal begins to move. And critically, we do not constrain eye movements during this movement period. Okay. So animals typically look first at one target and then at another. Right. So on some trials, the animal can choose to look first at the target with the right arm. And on other trials, may choose to look first at the target with the left arm. Okay. So this allows us to dissociate saccade and the reach without any sort of specialized training. Right. And I want to point out that we focus on the intervening time between when the instruction is given and the go cue. So this is a time period when the animal is planning the movement, but before any frank overt movement begins. Okay. All right. And we also have other kinds of trials. We have trials in which the animal makes only a single arm reach. All right. So I want to show you how the behavior unfolds here. So this is the behavior for our right arm reach, and I'm showing you time here along the x-axis, increasing from left to right. And the black traces here, represent saccades, and the red traces represent right arm reaches, right? And the trace has been aligned to the go cue. Okay? So the movement start times are indicated by where these color traces deflect from the lower horizontal gray line, right? And the end times, when they hit the target, are indicated by the color traces where they meet this upper horizontal.
Eric, your mouse isn't pointing to me here.
Thank you very much. That's interesting. Where is it pointing? It seems not to be.
Yeah, it's
what I expect.
It's the screen in the background, just full monitor.
Gotcha. All right, thank you. That's going to find confusing people. So anyway, this is where the black traces here are the saccade, these red traces are the right arm reaches, okay? And where the traces that deflect from this lower horizontal line is where the movement begins, and when they hit the upper line is where they get on target. Okay, so movement duration then is indicated by the horizontal extent of these color traces, right? So a shallower slope or a longer line indicates a longer movement duration. Okay, so after the go cue, what we see here is that the animal first saccades to the target, and this is followed very closely by a reach to that target. Okay. For the two target conditions, I split the traces up into two rows. All right, and so when the two arms move each to a separate target, on some trials the eyes go to I'll call the red target. Okay, and other trials, the eyes go to the green target. Okay, and in this particular example of configuration here, saccade direction is pretty evenly split. Okay, whereas in other configurations, the animal always moves its eyes to the same arm, right? And in other conditions, the split fell somewhere in between, right? But at any rate, now we have a task with identical reaches, but different saccades from trial to trial, right? So this now allows us to dissociate eye and arm movements without interfering with the animal's natural behavior, right? And so it's actually a little more complicated than this because not only can the eyes go to one target or the other, but we can also have the right arm go to the upper target, or we can have and the left arm go to the lower target, or vice versa. All right. So in this first part here, I'm going to tell you about how we took advantage of this natural saccade directed variability to ask whether LIP over PRR play a role in coordinating the eyes and arms. Right. The evidence for LIP or PRR involvement in coordinating saccade reaches is rather mixed. So for instance, in LIP, firing rates are modulated by coordinating saccade reaches compared to saccade alone. However, reversible inactivations for LIP do not affect eye-hand coordination. And in PRR, the response prior to saccade eye movement is only about half that observed for a coordinated saccade plus reach. Okay, and reversible inactivation experiments have shown conflicting results. Okay. If in fact eye-hand coordination is computed early in the dorsal strain in either of these areas, then we expect that whether the eyes move first to the target of the left arm or the right arm could have a strong effect on neural activity. Right. So going back to my example of the monkey picking some fruit with one hand while grasping a nearby branch with the other, which target will look at first, the apple or the branch? Okay. Or in terms of this experiment, does the animal look first to the target left or target right? The cells that we report from are spatially tuned, and we can place reach targets so that one is in the preferred direction cell in its response field, that's indicated here by this yellow arc, okay? And the other is placed 180 degrees across the fixation. Right, so this gives us 4 combinations of reach direction, depending on whether movements are into or out of the response field. Okay? So the eyes can move to the target in the response field, that's what we're showing in the left column there, or the eyes can move to the target out of the response field, and that's on the right. Okay. The right arm can also move to the target in the field, that's on top, or the right arm to move the target out of the field, that's on the plot. Okay. And what I'm going to focus on here is I'm movements that are into or out of the field. Right? We have a pretty straightforward prediction. If an area is involved in IM coordination, there should be an effect of saccade direction on the activity associated with bimanual reaches. Okay. So I looked first at PRR, and I'm going to plot the population average activity here. Right. So the target turns on here, okay, and then the animal begins movement. The saccade onset begins out here. Right. And this intervening time period is the delay period. And we're particularly interested in what happens in the late delay period, highlighted here in the spread. Okay. When animals make single arm reaches into saccade in the preferred direction cell, there's a sustained response up to the time of the saccade. Okay. And when the saccade reach is directed out of the field, notice that activity is suppressed up to the time of the saccade. Okay. So the question is, what happens when they must choose which way to saccade? Well, when they saccade into the field, so this is now when they are reaching making bimanual reaches and can look only one direction at a time and first. When they saccade into the field, responses begin high and sustained all throughout the delay period. Right? Okay, so now what happens when they move their eyes in the direction? Well, it's pretty clear. That there's no effect of the direction of the eyes. Right, so whether they move their eyes into or out of the field, there's the same response. Okay. Well, the most obvious interpretation of this, we think, is that saccade direction is simply not being coded when the animal reaches with both arms different targets. Okay. However, there are other possibilities. One possibility is that there really is an effect of saccade direction, but it's getting averaged out. Okay. So the animal might plan a saccade in one direction and then the other, and keep changing his mind, so to speak, throughout the trial. Okay, but in that case, we expect the firing rate should match the average of the black traces that I've shown. Right, but the response still is clearly well above that average. Right. Another possibility is that faced with the choice of saccade direction, the animal simply sort of stalls and doesn't have it decided. Right, he hasn't chosen which direction to saccade during the delay period. However, it is certainly the case that he must choose which way to saccade before beginning the saccade, right? And yet there's no difference all the way up to the time of saccade. Okay. Right. Finally, another possibility is that different cells are coding saccade in one direction or the other. Okay. Yet we see that the firing rates of all but 3 of our 40 neurons here do not distinguish between saccades in one direction or the other. So altogether, we think this is pretty clear evidence that PRR does not encode saccade direction. Okay, but maybe this isn't so surprising because this is an area that primarily cares about reaches. All right, so what about LNP? Well, just as with PRR, we see that whether the animal saccades into or out of the response field, there's no effect in the direction of the eyes. Okay. And we can rule out the same alternative explanations that I just did for PRR, right? And we see that firing rates only diverge after the time is not onset. Okay, and remarkably, none of the 29 cells that reported showed significantly greater activity for saccade into the field versus out. So this pattern of activity is inconsistent with coding of the direction of the coordinates. Right. So we can summarize here that in a bimanual reaching task, where saccades are naturally dissociated from one of the two reaches, that neither LIP nor PRR codes saccade direction. Right? And for LIP, this is particularly surprising because LIP activity has been interpreted as encoding, alternately encoding the goal of an upcoming saccade, so saccade intention, or a signal that drives the focus of spatial attention, known as priority map. Okay, or some high-level cognitive signal or some combination of these types of signals. Okay, but all of these models predict there should be differential activity saccades made into or out of the response field. Right. Of course, it does remain possible that the activity in these areas may provide downstream areas with one or more options about where to direct the eyes. Okay, so it could be that these regions play more of a permissive role in some aspects of eye coordination, but do not drive it.
Do you think if you recorded for more cells, you would maybe not see this inconsistency?
In other words, you're saying you think if we sort of missed the cells. I guess I can't rule out it completely, but I mean, it's a fair number of cells. Certainly, I mean, sort of standard electrodes compared to reporting hundreds of cells, right? But I suppose it's possible. I don't think it's likely.
Can I just clarify? So after the monkey saccades to one of the targets, does he also then click to the other one?
Yeah, he does typically respond. He does typically saccade to the second target. Yeah, on most trials.
So it's possible that they're planning both. I guess that's sort of what you said, right? Is that right?
Yeah, so that's interesting. So yeah, right. So are they planning the next saccade? So typically you think of the activity reflecting what the next saccade.
Right.
And so but we're not seeing that first saccade, right? Either. Okay, so so moving on, I want to tackle bimanual coordination. So how we reach depends on what it is we're trying to accomplish. So we might use just one arm to say grab a book from the shelf, but we might in other instances reach with both arms together, like say to catch a football that's shown here. And in other cases, we reach two different things at once, like grabbing an arm and copying a donut. Okay. In order to coordinate the moves of two arms, each arm needs to know what the other arm is doing. The classical view of motor control is that the distal musculature is controlled by the contralateral cerebral hemisphere. And this idea is supported by the observation that lesions produce contralateral deficits. But a strict contralateral organization doesn't allow for coordination between the two sides of the body. Right? On the other hand, human neuroimaging studies, reporting studies in monkeys, particularly of motor cortex, suggest there's some bilateral control. Right? And additionally, under either of these two schemes, limb information might be shared between the hemispheres. Right? Therefore, I tend to hypothesize that PRR is involved in the planning of coordinated movements. And our approach of focusing on the parietal cortex is notably different from previous work in two ways. The first is that primate recording studies of bimanual coordination have focused essentially exclusively on frontal motor areas. And yet there's multiple lines of evidence to suggest that the posterior parietal cortex is also critical for bimanual coordination. Right? Imaging studies show the recruitment of parietal areas for bimanual movements, and patients with colectomy of the posterior portion of the corpus callosum, which connects left and right parietal areas, show difficulty in coordinating bimanual movements. So one possibility is that bimanual signals exist locally in PRR. So in the first set of experiments, I asked whether PRR codes reach plans only for the contralateral end or shows bilateral signals. All right. Most single unit reaching studies have considered only the contralateral arm. So that is the arm contralateral to the reporting site. So, or the right arm reporting from the left hemisphere. Right. Since we wanted to address whether PRR has contralateral or bilateral reach representation, the first thing we did is we trained our monkeys to make reaches with either the left or the right arm. Okay. And as previously, okay, the responses here are going to be aligned on target onset here, right? And the reach onset begins out here. Okay. And again, I'm going to focus on the movement planning period. There, this highlight there, what was correct. Okay. Right. So I recorded the left hemisphere of two animals while they made interleaved left and right arm reaches. Okay. And so when I say contralateral, I'm referring to the right arm. When I say ipsilateral, I'm referring to the left arm. So for contralateral arm reaches, when the target was presented in the cell response field, for direction, there was a brisk response at target onset, and then the response is sustained throughout the delay period up to the time of the reach. Okay. When the target was presented in a null direction, opposite direction, firing was suppressed below baseline and remained low throughout the delay or time. So strict contralateral control predicts that when we now ask the monkey to reach with its ipsilateral arm, that there should be little or no activity regardless of direction. Okay, but instead what we find is that for ipsilateral arm reaches, response in the preferred direction is about half what we see in the contralateral arm. Okay, and the response in the null direction is similar regardless of which arm reaches. Okay, right. So this sort of is a mixed result. Because on the one hand, there is a response for the plan to move either arm. Okay, towards the response. But on the other hand, there's a clear bias. Okay. So to help resolve this, we turn to an interventional approach. Okay, so we can place a reversible lesion in PRR by injecting the GABA agonist Lucimol, and then look at the effect of the lesion on behavior. Okay, if there's a strict contralateral representation, then we should only see an effect on the arm contralateral to the side of the lesion. Okay, so here what I'm showing you is the predicted lesion effect, where a taller bar indicates some sort of greater deficit, so say slowing the reaction time. When we did this experiment, we found, as have others, that there's a selective slowing of reaction times for the contralateral arm, consistent with this hypothesis of organization. But a shortcoming of using a unilateral lesion is that this is the exact same outcome that we predict based on bilateral representation. Okay, because here too, we predict that the contralateral arm will be affected, and any sort of potential compensatory contribution of the ipsilateral hemisphere is going to be difficult to discern in mass. But these two models make unique predictions about the effect of bilateral lesions compared to. Okay, so if PR only affects the contralateral limb, then the bilateral lesion should have no additional effect on the first limb. Okay, no, it should be no additional effect. Okay, on the other hand, the bilateral representation model predicts that a second lesion will exacerbate the original deficit. Right, so since it removes not only the dominant contralateral drive, but also the covert ipsilateral. Right, so okay, so we might expect behavior looks something more like this. Okay, so we did this experiment and we find that when we add a second lesion in the other hemisphere, it results in the slowing of the arm contralateral to that second lesion. Okay, so this is the first lesion. We see the slowing. Now we add a second lesion and we see a slowing of this arm. And this is showing the average effect of the two arms, but there's no additional effect on that first arm. Okay. So together we need some pretty strong evidence for a contralateral representation in this area. Okay. Right. So far, this seems to be a contradiction between the single unit data that I've shown you and this lesion data. The lesion data indicated little or no effect of the ipsilateral arm, yet the unit data we see a clear modulation for ipsilateral arm movements. All right, so we addressed this by having the animals reach with both arms together. All right, when they reached with both of their arms to a single target, cued by the different color Q and square, response was very similar to what we observed for just the contralateral. Right? Similarly, we had animals reach with each arm to a different target, as shown here. In this case, one arm moved in the field and one more arm moved out. Okay. When the contralateral arm moved into the response field, the response again looked similar to as it does for a contralateral arm alone. Okay. On trials when the arms had to be crossed and the ipsilateral arm reached into the field, then the response looks similar to that for an ipsilateral arm for each of them. Okay. And finally, we also asked the animal just to make so no roots at all. And we find that response again, this black trace here, looks like it does for just the ipsilateral arm reach. Okay, so there are a lot of conditions here and a lot of traces. Okay, but notice that all of these conditions have in common that there's a target appearing in the response field. Okay, and these conditions have in common a target appearing in the response field, and additionally, that the animal will reach to that target with its with the contralateral arm to that target. Okay, so our interpretation of these results is that PR responds to the presence of the relevant stimulus target in the field, okay, and there's an additional response when there's a plan to reach with the contralateral arm to that target, okay? So the population activity of PRR codes what the contralateral arm will do. All right, so I'm showing the same result in a simplified form. These essentially the same, or these are the same matrix responses, but just plotted as a bar plot. And I think this interpretation broadly summarizes the population response. Nevertheless, if we look at these bars, it's pretty clear that the bar heights are not identical, right? So, and if we look at individual cells, we see clear idiosyncratic coding of different types of region about half of the cells that are recorded from. And if we use things like a support vector machine classifier, we can easily distinguish amongst all of our conditions. Okay. So the results from our single unit reporting studies drive two main conclusions. The first is that each parietal hemisphere is responsible for coding or planning movement of the contralateral limb. Okay. And second, that the contralateral limb response is modulated depending on what the ipsilateral arm will do. Right? And the variability observed in these conditions suggests that PR does have some information about what the ipsilateral arm is going to do. And so then I next wanted to address whether that information might be coming from PRR in the opposite hemisphere. Because that's what I'll tell you about next. All right. So what I'm showing you here is sort of highly schematized view of PRR in the left and right hemispheres. And the weights of the arrows here show the amount of connections. So most output of PRR projects locally, okay, but there are also some long-range projections, including to PRR in the opposite hemisphere. Likewise, most inputs are local in origin, but again, there's some inputs that come from distant regions, including PRR. Right? So when we record with our single electrodes, we typically high pass the raw signal, and we around 1,000 hertz or so, and we'll get spiking information. Right? The spike we record from are coming from cell bodies and axons, and we think reflect aerial output. And these are the kind of data that we talked about so far. We can also low pass that signal, say below 300 hertz or so, and we get the local field potential. Okay, so these are slower signals that are thought to reflect electrical events happening in the synapse and the dendrites, and therefore thought to reflect aerial input. Okay. One way to look at shared information is to ask, are there shared information in both hemispheric area? And this is difficult to do with our spiking data since spikes are so variable. So the LFP is a more powerful approach. Right? So we record from PRR in each hemisphere simultaneously, and we record LFP coherence between the left and right PRR. And we use that as a measure of how many information. Okay. And our hypothesis here is that interhemispheric sharing of information should depend on the pattern of the arguments. All right, so here I'm showing the LFP coherence. And the black trace there is showing the baseline level of coherence that we observed during the intertrial interval. Right? If an animal needs to move only one arm, there may be no need to share information, and we might predict that coherence will remain at or near baseline. And that's actually what we observed. But now what happens when the animal responds with both arms? Well, when both arms reach to a single target, they're required to be both spatially and temporally coordinated. And in this case, we expect the coherence to increase compared to baseline, and that's in fact what we observed. Right, so compared to either the baseline or our trace, which shows up here. I think the zoom is full.
Yes, it did.
Looks like there's no red.
That's not like it.
This is Should we try that? Let's see if we can better, but- You see it, okay. Okay, let me just see if I can run this.
I mean, lately it has just been routing.
Pretty serious.
Let me see, you guys said it wrong.
Okay, so.
Yeah. Also try connecting.
Yeah. It's not connected.
Hmm. Okay. Huh. Everybody can still hear us, right? Yes. Okay.
Oh, I'm getting the protection.
You're getting it back. Okay.
This doesn't happen to me necessarily. You.
Oh, I have had this happen, yeah, lately, often. Yeah, this morning I have been doing today.
Oh, I see.
Yeah, there is no connector, but that's something we should have in the future for sure. It's. See if I can, do you have a Ethernet connection on your computer?
Yeah.
Okay, well, there goes that idea.
You need an adapter or something?
Yeah, do you have an Ethernet adapter?
Ethernet, I don't know. No.
I guess.
Can you connect to guest?
Please, yes.
I think
Wait,
you-
now,
Yeah, I think you have to rejoin this.
Okay, so I'm gonna be doing this. Gotcha. This.
Okay. Try sharing the screen. Okay.
Is that you now?
Here, do it again. Close, now you can share.
Yeah.
Do you have to hit yes?
Bill signs this.
Yes.
Yes.
Okay. Dancing or something, and everyone will be waiting.
Let's see. There you go. Okay. Okay, we're back. Okay. Hopefully people listening haven't given up. Okay,
Well, they heard us the whole time.
so. I'm not sure how long it was. Okay, so. All right, so at any rate, so we asked about we're looking at electrical coherence here and just not sure what we all missed. So we first saw that there's a baseline level of coherence here shown by the black trace, okay? And then we asked, how does coherence change? We looked at our different reach types, right? And you might expect that for medium regions, no need to share information from hemispheres, and therefore coherence may not differ from baseline. And that's what we saw shown there in the light gray trace. Okay, so now what happens when the animal makes bimanual reaches, right? So for a bimanual together reach, we call it here, the animal uses both arms to the same target. In this case, the animal has to both temporally and spatially coordinate this, right? So in that case, we might expect that coherence will increase compared to baseline. That's what we see depicted there. For
Record.
real, we actually see it, okay?
Oh, yeah, we did stop recording.
You report.
No, gosh, I should have been recording the whole time. Oh, yeah, I think it's still recording.
I think it is,
Okay.
I think it is recorded.
Yeah.
Okay, okay, so we. Okay, all right, and so we see this increase in coherence and it's specifically over the beta frequency range, right? But it remains unchanged at other frequency ranges. All right, so now finally, what do we see when there's that arms are spatially associated like our binomial part task here, right? Well, in this case, you could think of it as being useful to functionally decouple the activity in the two hemispheres, right? So one way this could happen is by decreasing interhemispheric coherence, right? So we might predict that the coherence in this condition would not be different from baseline or even be decreased compared to baseline. Okay. And all right, and lo and behold, that's what we see that compared to baseline or the unique conditions, that there's this there's less coherence over the beta frequency range, but again, it's unchanged at other frequencies. All right, so our LFP coherence indicates that there is shared information on the two sides. Right. So because while the hands normally benefit from talking to each other to achieve a common goal, are working together, that this crosstalk we think is being detrimental when we want to perform independent action. Okay. All right. One concern with this sort of approach, though, is that this shared signal that we're observing could be due to common input to the two sides. Right. Now, this is the case where we can use the spike and LFP data to address this. Okay. Since spikes reflect aerial output and LFP reflect aerial input, we thought that the spike LFP coherence might provide a better measure of direct communication. All right. So we also computed spike LFP coherence, and we find that it's high for bimanual together regions, intermediate for bimanual regions, and it's low for bimanual part regions. Right. We also have some coherence by chance. That's what I'm showing dashed color traces there. The gray shading is showing the 95% confidence interval. So anything that's outside of this box is significant P105. And then there's a light gray line up here, and that is significance of P104. Okay. So now both our spike LFP and our LFP coherence measures indicate that there is some cross hemisphere information sharing. Right. But it still doesn't rule out common input. But we can better address this now with the spike LP data because we can look at the relative timing of the two signals. Okay, and these two models, so interhemispheric communication or common input, make different predictions about the typical relationships between spikes on one side and LFP on the other. Right. So if LFP reflects semantic input, and semantic input in PRR is driven in part by spikes in PRR in the opposite hemisphere, then we might expect the greatest effect of the spikes on the left here, right, on the LFP on the right there would occur only after a short conduction delay. Right, in the common input scenario, on the other hand, so LFPs on both sides are being driven by a common input, okay, and then the LFPs drive spikes. Since LP drives spikes, and the greatest coherence should occur if the spikes are lagged relative to the LFP rather than vice versa in the upper example. Okay. So in other words, coherence should peak when LFP means spikes. Okay, when we compute the lag, and that's what we show there, and we compute this, we see that coherence peaks when LFP lags spikes by approximately 10 milliseconds. This is again consistent with it being a direct communication between the two sides. All right. Still, the best way to address common input is by using an interdimensional approach. The major white matter tract that connects to the hemisphere to the cortex callosum. So what we did is we first went and identified white matter pathways that connect between left and right PRR using a technique called in vivo manganese enhanced MRI. Briefly, what that means is that we can inject manganese, which is translucent on an MRI, inject it into PRR. The manganese is taken up by cells and then it spreads via anterograde transport by axons. And because the manganese is paramagnetic, we can visualize the manganese transport by taking MRI scans after the injection. Okay, so when we image the animal on successive days, we tracked the movement of manganese throughout the brain. Okay, and when we did that, we found that the axons connecting left and right PRR via across the callosum were restricted to the spleen, so the posterior portion of the cortex callosum, and that's going to show a highlight outline in red here, and then we zoom in on that here on the right. Okay, so then we go in and we can, first we block this pathway using focal injections of lidocaine right into that region, while the animal will perform the very same task that we showed you. Okay, so this is data similar to what I just showed you, but in new data sets, unique data sets. So in a control session, the coherence pattern was similar to what I just showed you. I'm focusing just on our two binomial conditions. So coherence was higher put together than per part, specifically ordered over the beta frequency range. Okay, then we inject lidocaine into the corpus callosum to block conduction, and what we see is that the task. Sorry. The task-specific coherence effects go away. Okay, so we think this is very strong evidence for direct communication. So in conclusion for this part, we've shown that there's evidence from sequence unit reporting and reversible activation to support the idea that PRR activity primarily reflects movement plans for the contralateral. Okay, and information about the two limbs is shared across the hemispheres in a frequency and task-specific manner. Okay, and we conclude from this that the posterior frontal cortex integrates information about movements of the left and right limbs, perhaps in service of bimanual coordination. Okay, so I've lost track of how much time we actually have. So I'm going so right? But I'd like to use a little bit of time here talking about some current future directions in my life. Right? I think the work that I just discussed opens up a lot of interesting directions for future work. There's some obvious things I can do by manual line of work by simply recording some motor areas or asking about frontal-parietal communication. But with my time here today, I'd like to focus on one new line in particular, which is examining issues surrounding the issue of limb selection, or how do we decide which hand to use for a connection. And I was also going to point out that again, I just talked about this in monkey physiology data, but prior to becoming a monkey physiologist, my training was in experimental psychology and using cognitive neuroscience approaches to ask sort of similar kinds of questions in humans. And so, sort of with that in mind, I want to think about these questions going forward and sort of bringing to bear my entire toolkit, both in animal models and in human models. All right. Okay. So at any rate, we frequently encounter tasks that can be performed with either hand. So for example, imagine that you want to think of a coffee mug that's placed in front of you. You use your left or your right hand. Or perhaps maybe you are going to enter a room and need to flip on the light switch as you enter. The decision of which hand you're going to use to flip that switch is influenced by many factors, including what each hand is already doing. So are you holding your cell phone? What is the proximity of each limb to that switch? What are your future goals? Do you plan to walk into the room and pick up the keys off of the counter? So forth. We are confronted with these sorts of alternatives all the time and need to decide which limb to use. And so the question is, how does the brain make these types of decisions? Well, whether we use the left arm or the right arm depends on various factors, including handedness, recent choice success, as well as biomechanical factors. So if there are two equidistant targets, people tend to choose to move to the target that can be reached the lowest biomechanical cost. Okay. It's covered that people tend to think that handedness is surely the big driver of all these choices. You're right-handed, use your right hand, right? But it is not the case that that is strictly true. The roles of the hands are quite flexible. So just because someone is right-handed does not mean that the right hand will play the leading role. Okay. And in the lab studies have almost exclusively considered hand choice just in a single dimension with experiments like this, where somebody has to reach out to an LED, point to an LED along the part, like something like this. But we want to be able to move beyond reach in a sort of a single dimension and ask about, well, ultimately in 3D, but even as an intermediate step, what happens in a 2-dimensional workspace? So we have devised a task in which subjects must touch a target that is this falling on the top and bottom of the touch screen. Sort of the stimulus here. I'm showing you here, this is what the task looks like. And there's a stimulus here that is actually falling, moving from the top of the screen to the bottom, blown up. The stimulus looks something like this. Okay. And the subject must reach out and touch this target, being sure to touch the green portion of it and avoiding touching the red. Okay. And not only do they make that touch, but this gray bar is moving in the opposite direction, moving upwards, and they have to touch that target while it's intersecting the gray bar. Okay, and this is what it looks like. Okay, and notice here that her hands are starting from central position in front of her, but move those hand positions as well. All right. And for now, I'm just focusing on this sort of first order question is which hands does the subject choose to use to perform this task. And here are some data from some pilot subjects, and these plots show the proportion of time that subjects reached with their right arm to target at each location on the screen. All right, as we might expect, they reached the rightmost positions with their right hand, and the leftmost positions with their left hand. But notice that the boundary is not clear, right? So where they switch from one hand to the other, it's not just an absolute, right? Notice spot where there's some gradation here, and also notice there's quite a bit of variability across subjects. Okay. We also like this task because it really gives us a lot of opportunity to probe things like the optimality in people's reaches. So what we can vary the difficulty of the stimulus by playing with the overlap of these regions and the rate of movement and so forth. So allowing us to really characterize completely sort of the parameter space and really sort of turn a lot of dials, if you will, to understand and to drive limb selection. Okay. So this is the project that we are sort of getting going now. But in this paradigm and really this experimental paradigm, notice that discrete cues are used. But in reality, we make decisions in much more dynamic situations, right? We're not waiting for some cue, okay? And there's no timing signal to tell you when to do something. We make decisions on the fly. We also want to ultimately understand limb selection in those kind of environments. So, for instance, we can think of tasks like what I'm showing you here, where after we complete a puzzle task, something like the Tower of Noise, say, where the subject has to take these rings on a pole here, and the job is to move them from this one location to this other location, following a set of rules. And using a task like this, we can basically watch and record people perform this task without giving any sort of explicit instruction about how to do it with respect to mark use, and really describe at a baseline level how do people choose to use their limbs. I'd also like to understand the neural underpinnings of these sorts of motor decisions. So returning to this coherent result from a few slides ago, we made sort of an implicit assumption there that intrahemispheric communication is really only required when the two arms need to be coordinated. Right? So when one arm needs to know what the other arm is doing, as with our bimanual movements, and not so much for unimanual movements. But a critical point is that in all the tasks I used, those unimanual movements were instructed. Right? There was no deliberation required, no choice to be made. So what happens when an animal or person decide which arm to use? Okay. In psychological models of decision making. Decisions are described as a rising from a serial process, right? There's perception, separate stages: perception, cognition, and action. In neurobiological models, the focus has been on describing decision making as bounded accumulation process, right? So movement plans for competing options are prepared in parallel, and then that competition is resolved when the activity of one plan reaches a threshold first. Okay? And the vast majority of studies so along these lines have focused on perceptual decisions, okay, and focused on areas like LFP and using eye movements as a readout of a perceptual decision about some tools. Evidence that hand selection may arise from competition from simultaneously activated plans comes from things like alien hand syndrome, when a person loses control of their hand, which seems to start to act independently. And this is a frame from the movie Dr. Strangelove, where one of the characters sort of famously exhibited alien hand, and he was trying to fight off one hand in this case and kill himself. And you hear examples in the patient literature where people describe trying to button their shirt with one hand while the other hand is interfering and kind of unbuttoning their shirt at the same time. Right? So this is supporting the idea that there is this interhemispheric requirement to sort of managing these situations. Okay? And I should say explicitly here that sort of alien hand syndrome typically involve a callosal lesion along with other lesions. Okay. So and hopefully it's already convincing. Go ahead, I'm sorry. I didn't say this explicitly, but I should say that the neuronal populations that specify sensory motor parameters for control are also known to mediate action choices. Okay, so that's sort of the background point here. Hopefully, I've said enough to already convince you that PPC and particular parietal reach region and other reach-related areas are sort of prime targets to start looking for these sort of motor decision types of signals in the brain. And I'll show you an example here from Mike Shadwell's group. From Mike Shadwell's lab showing that there is evidence for arm-related areas in the PPC do exhibit evolving decision variables, right? So this is a case, again, from the perceptual decision task. Again, that we're asked to look at a moving dot stimulus and indicate whether some motion was, say, to the left or to the right by reaching to a spatial target, okay? So this is now in a reach area, but it's again related mainly to a perceptual kind of decision. Okay. So we can look at these same areas and then armed with the type of three-dimensional limb preference maps that I've described here, we can place targets so as to encourage responses of each arm into a cognitive response to their neurons. In the case of single unit recordings, or just more generally to place construct situations to encourage equal limb use, say in the confines of an MRI scanner with human participants. Okay. Sorry, there's a little lag here on my slides. I apologize. So this is what I was just trying to say was that as a sort of a point example that we can, like an example I showed you with the human pilot data, we can map out what the limb preference is across the two-dimensional workspace, and then armed with that, set up our experiments to so that we have equal use of the left and right limbs across the workspace. Okay, and so then we are set up to ask lots of questions here about what is the activity in PPC and the perception on what areas exhibit that have decision variables related to motor responses, right? So in the single unit data, we might think of this like looking at the buildup rate of the fire rate in the cells, or in my task, related to signals related to different decisions, right? And then we can ask about the direction, the strength and direction of communication between the two sides of the brain. right? So does that communication depend on which hand is selected? Okay, and how does it evolve over time? And how does it, you know, does it stop when the decision is reaches threshold, et cetera? Okay, and we can apply our same tools of comparative measures and other direct measures like random causality and effective measures and so forth. Okay, and we can ask that can drive a bias in one or the other limb by limiting the activity in the left or the right hemisphere, or so forth. And then finally, just sort of a coda on things here, relating this back to the first part of my talk, we can now ask, well, what are the eyes doing throughout all of this? And put together, make up with the eye, how eyes are moving in relation to what the arms are doing. Yeah, and so with that, I think I'm going to finish, and I would like to acknowledge all of my collaborators, past and present. All of the single unit data that's shown today was collected at WashU in the lab of Larry Snyder, and lots of input from various people in the lab over the years. I also want to acknowledge my sort of burgeoning lab here at UCSD, my various research assistants, and as well as my collaborators at SALT, Tom Albright and Sergey Epstein in particular. Yeah, with that, I'm finished.
What sort of, so you outlined a whole bunch of different possible theories of how decisions are made. How are you planning on disentangling those different stories, or is that one story that's kind of just rewritten itself over time? Like where those all.
So I guess it's a great point. It's sort of a story that's sort of rewritten itself, I think, over time. I think a lot of the really data from people like Paul Cizik in particular really shown that this evidence support of these planning of parallel planning of movements in up to the time of the motor decision, right? But I think that's one good thing, sort of written. The data supports that point of view.
Is there an alternative framework or?
But well, sure, the alternative framework is that there's much more sequential processing here in the serial stages of decision making, where we make, if I choose something, I'm going to reach with my left arm, and then that is sent to, my right motor cortex, and then I program my right arm reach or something. But I think the evidence is really more supportive of form. Yeah.
Any questions online?
Yeah, hi, it's Gordon Kubrick. I was just wondering, have you seen or done any work on prefrontal cortex involvement and basal ganglia involvement in these kinds of decisions?
Great question. No, I have not. I have not moved beyond the parietal cortex, actually. I mean, yeah, I'm not really sure what to say. I haven't personally done that. I think there are lots of opportunities there. Certainly, one of my, I sort of skipped over this in future directions, but I think the natural way to go would be to look at premotor cortex, dorsal premotor cortex bilaterally, and also look at frontal and parietal areas simultaneously for both IPSI and contralateral projections, and asking about basically applying some same tools that I've already applied. So I think it's sort of the natural way to go, but we have not done that.
Thanks.
Any other questions?
To explain the thinking what happens when the monkey are doing some fine motor skill.
Fine motor skill.
Yeah, instead of like reaching the certain growth, right? Yeah, so would you explain the same way they will talk to each other?
Yes, that's a good question. What happens if the animal's not doing these sort of large sort of gross movements with his fine motor skills? So I think the basic way of thinking about this is that this lateralized control motor control is increasingly lateralized as you move from the midline to more distal musculature, right? So for fine finger movements, I expect maybe this to be even stronger in terms of the sort of strong contralateral representation.
Yeah, because I was imagining, for instance, when you are playing pianos,
Yeah,
sometimes they were moving forward to the same direction, and sometimes they will have the same movement, but very, yeah, so you can create a very complicated scenarios.
yeah, when I think about things like the musician playing the piano, I start to think about like how expertise. Sort of change everything I've talked about here, right? So with that sort of level of skill, how does that? Have they increase or possibly decrease communication in some?
So they're
Or they
very
have better
complicated.
able to work independently, right? The two limbs. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank Steve here once more.